Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Oxys Corporate Performance Series webinar, Supply Chain Excellence, a critical link to driving profitability. My name's Yazan Arroyo, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is presented by Oxys. Oxys is a leading consulting and outsourcing firm that specializes in helping senior executives drive efficiency and cost savings through process improvement, shared services design and implementation, technology solutions, and innovative nearshore strategies. We've helped hundreds of the largest multinational and mid-sized companies become more profitable and successful by delivering a real-world, results-oriented approach and a refreshing alternative to the pricey and slow-moving delivery models of traditional consulting firms. At this point, I'd like to introduce our first featured speaker, Manny Cueto. Manny Cueto is the Vice President of Management Consulting for Oxys, with more than 20 years of experience in all aspects of global logistics, shared services and outsourcing operations, integrations, and strategy. He has extensive experience leading multiple business transformations through significant change across multiple and disparate geographies. Our second presenter is David Galindo. David is a supply chain leader at Oxys with over 12 years of experience providing solutions in supply chain and finance. David has worked in multinational Fortune 500 organizations and provided consulting services in various business sectors. In past engagements, David has worked with key decision makers to align sales and operating plans to supply chain strategies, create complex landed cost models, execute business strategies, and implement cost-saving measures through process improvements. Before we begin, let me remind all participants we welcome your questions. Please submit them in your webinar panel at any time. We'll address your questions at the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Manny. Manny?
Great. Thank you, Yaslin, and good afternoon. As Yaslin mentioned, I'm the Vice President for Management Consulting, overseeing all aspects of our delivery services. I've been consulting in one form or fashion for the last 20 years. And during these years, I've worked directly or been involved in a number of supply chain initiatives and have gained the experience and realization of not only what it takes to lead a successful supply chain excellence initiative, but as well as what I will call the backstage activities that are key to ensure success. The webinar today that David and I will present is rich in information, so I hope you will learn from it. Let me over for David. He's going to give you a little bit of background on himself as well.
Thank you, Manny. I'm really excited to present this rich information in this webinar series. It's truly the best practices of what we've seen in our supply chain clients and engagements in the past. I spent 6 years in the military working in logistics, then moved to Ryder Systems, and in the past 3 years, been here at Oxys working in the process improvement division within the supply chain management services area in Oxys. So it's been a great ride so far, and this webinar series is essentially the best practice of what we've seen within supply chain, and I hope you guys enjoy.
Great. With that, let me start with a little bit of our agenda for today. To start with, I'm going to take a step back with a quick look on supply chain excellence. I'll hit on challenges and trends, talk a little bit about what actually is supply chain excellence versus supply chain management, talk a little bit about the benefits of supply chain excellence, which is more than just cost reduction and savings, and then talk about how supply chain excellence can be applied. At that point, David's going to dive into the key supply chain excellence levers, and then from there we're going to follow up with the key takeaways from today's presentation, and at that point we will conclude and open it up for questions and answers. Okay? With that, let's go ahead and begin. So if you look at supply chain excellence, many of you have heard that term, and in a moment we're going to actually get into the definition. But if you look at the challenges today in the marketplace as we speak of supply chain excellence, many organizations out there are unable to really define what are the appropriate metrics to use in order to manage against the performance of their operations. It's not only unable to apply the right metrics, It's equally important that we see out there many clients just have difficulty in even defining what measures to use. Other key challenges that we see out there are prioritizing what are the improvement efforts in order to get you towards that level of supply chain excellence. And many of the clients and projects that we work on, we actually get in deep into understanding the benefits of initiatives. We look at the cost, we look at the savings, and then we also look at and compare that against the ease of implementation. We look at that across processes. We look at that against technology or investments of capital, and then we also closely look at what is the impacts to the organization from a change management perspective. So we look at it from a multiple dimension point of view, but the point here is there's got to be a framework in place that allows you to prioritize your improvement in initiatives. The other key area I think is important to understand as a key challenge out in the marketplace is the customers are ever asking for more. They're increasingly very volatile in what their expectations are or their demands. Customers nowadays, especially from the consumer point of view, have that now mentality. And many people, over the years, many people have purchased on the internet. And when you order something, in the past, it's taken a week, sometimes 2 weeks to get there. And if you use today's examples, is people now are asking that their products to be derived and delivered overnight. Classical example is like with Amazon Prime, where what you order today, there's a strong expectation on how to get there overnight because that's what the customers are demanding. If you can't do it, they're going to go somewhere else so that they can get their products in a timely manner. And yeah.
And Manny, that's exactly right. I mean, I am one of those people that just want it now, right? I'm in that culture of I want it now and results oriented, right?
So with that, I wanted to share a little bit of the top trends I think that are key. I'm really going to hit on or focus on the top two. We talked about cost. Part of supply chain excellence is cost, but it's not only about cost, and in a minute I'll talk about how it really focuses on increasing profitable sales growth. But if you look at the trends over the last 5 years, it consistently comes on as one of the top goals of management. And equally important is that around reducing inventory levels. Inventory levels and reduction is basically around having the right product at the right place at the right time. And when you get to inventory, it's really around having the right quantity of product. When it's needed, it's available. And one of the interesting facts that I wanted to touch on, if you look at the bottom of the slide, when you look at the supply chain survey that we've listed several points there, one interesting fact is between 31 and 40% of the companies say their operations team never or rarely meet with sales. One of the key aspects of supply chain excellence is closely interaction or internal communications, not just with operation or among themselves, but just as important, or probably as or more important, I would say, is working with your sales and marketing organizations. They're the ones that have the pulse of the market. They're the ones that are working with the customers in terms of upcoming demands or forecasts of sales, and then they're also working in the background with new product development. So we've worked with many clients around what we call S&OP, or sales and operations planning, and that is really key in terms of having a formalized program in place that allows a structured format of bringing the sales organization, the marketing organization, operations. You also have finance as well as R&D organizations come into play on a regular basis. And today we're not going to talk in detail around S&OP, but it's mostly about having regularly scheduled meetings, whether it's weekly for certain types of meetings all the way through monthly with executive level S&OP. But the key takeaway is the communication and the decisions to really understand what products and where those products need to be and when, so that you avoid any excess inventory, or on the other side is not having enough inventory. Right. So let's talk a little bit more now about what is supply chain excellence. As I'd mentioned before, it's all about contributing to profitable sales growth, right? And that is really by creating cost and service advantages. And it's not just that. Flexibility is a key point to supply chain excellence. I talked about the volatile and ever-changing demands, the customer base and consumers out in the marketplace. You're constantly trying to get product to market quicker. You're always trying to have a better product. You always have competitors in place, and you always have service levels based on the demands of your customer base that you're always trying to reach. Given that, let's talk a little bit about what it's not. So supply chain excellence is not about the ability to facilitate just cost savings and provide a competitive advantage. It's, as I mentioned, it's really supporting in alignment with your overall company strategies, profitable sales growth, and flexibility. It's not just getting the right product to the right place, as I mentioned in my earlier slide. It's really understanding how you do it in a profitable way that supports the overall alignment of the strategies of the organization and ensuring that customer service requirements and service levels are constantly being met. Supply chain excellence is also about bringing all parties involved. This is upstream and downstream partners. This is external and this is internal. It's bringing them into the loop, whereas supply chain management tends to only focus on the internal aspects of your organization. Now, if we look at supply chain excellence as more than just being savings, we talked about the excellence being involved with delivering efficiencies, leading to lower cost and higher margins, and that's part of driving a continual or a consistency to improve margins. But it's also about the increased effectiveness of your organization. For example, companies that are considered to be best practice organization in moving product to market enjoy at least a 45% supply chain cost advantage over their competitors. And another comment that I wanted to make around achieving more than savings around excellence, it's about talent. It's about the organization. Just like physical assets, a company's organizational knowledge can depreciate or you can lose it over time. This can really affect or mute a company's quality performance initiatives. Workers, as everyone knows, they come and go. There's new technology coming constantly into the market, and raw materials sometimes suffer in quality and take a nosedive. And all of this, which can work against a business striving to enhance the quality of their products. So, for example, firms need to implement improvements with suppliers, and then that initiative improvement begins to slowly degrade. And it's the depreciation of an organization's knowledge. And what I mean by that is a lot of work and effort has been put into working with suppliers, for example. It's put into a lot of knowledge, building learnings and knowledge into the organizations. It's put into effect with initiatives that improve and increase the overall performance of an organization. But if you're not constantly monitoring, you're not constantly controlling, and you're not constantly staying on top of it, or if you just let it go and just jump on other initiatives, over time the effects of those initiatives will degrade or deteriorate to the point that they provide no value or performance impact to the organization.
And I also want to add to that it's important to have senior leadership involved and understand the benefits of achieving supply chain excellence, which are the points that Manny just mentioned. Because it all starts with creating the culture for obtaining supply chain excellence, as we see in that evolution. So once senior leadership is involved, I think the rest of the evolution is much easier.
Thanks, David. So on the next slide, it's really how can supply chain excellence be applied? If you look at this framework, it's important that you start with getting your house in order. In order to do this, you must develop a strategy. That strategy within supply chain has to be aligned with the overall strategy of your organization. And once a strategy is in place, it's equally important to identify, in this particular case, we're going to review today 5 key levers of supply chain excellence. And these are the levers that, from our experiences and the work we've done, with our clients are what we consider the top contributors in order to support a strategy, all the way from a technology platform through the performance management. It's one of those, you can't manage what you can't measure, and you really don't know there's a problem until you actually start measuring it or tracking it. So having the ability to extract data and manage and interpret and analyze that data is very key. And then the pillars that support that go across flexibility, alignment and collaboration across the network with your partners, and equally important is, once you have that established, how do you instill or install a culture for continuous improvement. Continuous improvement is not a project, it's an ongoing program that always looking for creative, new, innovative ways to improve upon your supply chain organization and in its support of its overall strategy to your organization.
And also, like I said before, earlier in our presentation, these are probably the 5 key levers, we're calling it levers, that we've seen that work within a great supply chain organization. So this whole discussion of how this webinar started was Manny and I sitting down talking about where we want to get to as far as the supply chain initiatives, and we started thinking about how, going through all these projects, what differentiates a great supply chain organization among just good organizations, right? And then we started just piggybacking off of ideas, and we started developing what essentially turned out to be 5 levers of what made this organization, this client, better than this other client. So these 5 levers is what separated good to great supply chain organizations.
Good. And then one last comment I want to make here is, being good at one of these pillars or one of these levers is not supply chain excellence. Yes, it's a good start, but the focus here, or the end state, is really having all 5 of these levers working in unison. So they're working like gears, and then they all work in a mainstream direction. So it's not about just having one working well. It's about developing the 5 levers and having those 5 levers working together. At this point, David's going to walk us through the levers. The way these have been designed today, we want to show you, as we go through the 5 levers, a practical case study of what's worked and what hasn't worked. And then we're going to show you then how to achieve or attain the level of excellence for that particular lever.
Okay, thanks, Manny. So the first, the foundation, as we saw in the previous slide, is technology systems. Now, here in this case study, it's about Hershey's and how this is a great example of how and why technology systems are so important within the supply chain organization. And that's why it's our first key lever. Hershey's, in this case study, was switching over to an ERP system, and they wanted to implement it in Q1. The reason being is that the majority of their sales come from Q3 and Q4, especially, Halloween, the busiest season, then running into the holidays. So they wanted to make a big effort to get the ERP launched in Q1. Now, with any ERP implementation, as all our audiences understand, is that there's delays. There's stuff that you cannot foresee, or you try to foresee, but things go wrong. And what happened here in Hershey's case study is that they failed to understand and link how important and valuable the ERP was and intertwined within the whole organization, especially supply chain. So now as a result of this, they were unable actually to launch at the predetermined Q1 expectation, and they rushed into the implementation. And by rushing into the ERP implementation, they now dug up all these errors, and they were astounded at how much or how intertwined the ERP was throughout the whole supply chain process. And it created distribution problems within the problems and communication problems between the ERP, the warehouses, that was primarily driven within the third party in Hershey's case, resulting in inventories stacking up 25% more when compared to the prior year. So what this caused was that Hershey's missed $100 million worth of profits due to improper ERP implementation because it was so intertwined with the supply chain organization. Now, then this next slide here is how that trickles down to supply chain, essentially. So if you look at supply chain, you think of order management systems, you think of warehouse management systems, transportation systems. Now, all that can be linked within an ERP system. They're all talking together, especially if you have a well-functioning, oiled machine. As Manny put it, the gears are running smoothly. So with this, one thing to take out of this is that, one, how technology is important within the overall supply chain excellence strategy. And also, let's talk about this Go Fever. If we look back to the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986, what went wrong there? It's been highly documented. Essentially, it was the O-ring that malfunctioned. It wasn't. It didn't operate properly under certain temperatures. And what happened was they had been delaying the process 10 times actually, and then higher management decided to just go on with it, regardless of what the engineers were saying, how it was probably not going to work adequately given the low temperatures in that of January of that year. So they had Go Fever. So they were overly committed to a previously chosen course of action, and which led to obviously the disaster, the unfortunate disaster of the Challenger in 1986. Now this goes well and in line with what I'm saying here with the ERP systems, how it has to be properly managed, properly planned out, and you have to understand all the intricacies involved, especially within supply chain, because you are distributing to your customers, and ERP has a big focus on this. So you want to make sure you get all the information and useful information out of the ERP, but taking into account all the intricacies involved.
One quick add-on comment here is we've had clients that we've worked with that have miserably failed at ERP implementations because of lack of proper project management, lack of stakeholder involvement. We've had projects where we've come in and assessed and quickly realized that the problem with not succeeding in ERPs is you have an IT organization trying to drive a project and not really including all the stakeholders that are ultimately going to be impacted by the implementation, as opposed to having, for example, if you're going to do something from a warehousing or from a transportation management perspective, the one that should be running it is the business side, not the IT side, and the IT side should be the side that should be supporting the overall business in implementing the systems and really understanding the requirements, the change management impacts that really need to be addressed before embarking on any of these projects. Another comment I want to make quickly on technology, as many of you heard, cloud computing continues to go mainstream. And as in the past, we've talked about local installs and so forth. But if you look at cloud computing, the speed to execution is much faster. It comes at a lower cost. You don't have to be involved with all the hardware and all the software installs at all the locations. Allows you to reach higher service levels. And all this is very compelling in that more and more companies today are migrating towards this path as they look at ERPs and as they're looking to point solutions that are integrated with ERPs within the spectrum of supply chain.
Good. Thanks, Manny. Now we run into the second key lever, and here's performance measurement. I want to give you a great example of where performance measurement culture changed the results of a company. Just to give you a little background, Danaher is a corporation designs, manufactures, and markets professional, medical, industrial, and commercial products and services worldwide. Now, before the CEO, Lawrence Culp, came into the organization, the results of Danaher were very flat. Once he came in with essentially a vision of how these processes are intertwined and how we need to measure performance and develop a culture of continuous improvement. So he basically articulated this very well in his first State of the Union, if you will, to his shareholders. He said his role is to ensure that the company has a clear and well-articulated strategy coupled with the right people to execute that strategy. And what he essentially created was a process improvement performance measurement team within the organization. strictly focusing on that core culture of his background, which is based on measuring results first. And by doing so, he was able, if you see that chart, that's just only the last 10 years, but essentially it had performed the market, S&P 500, way above expectations. That graph shows 172% increase of the shares for Danaher. And so it's very important to create that culture, and that's what I mentioned earlier, is you need to have senior leadership involved to be able to enhance that culture. And here the next slide is the evolution of that. You are probably within those 5 stages that I show up there. You have to understand where you're at, but essentially you start off with stage 1, and what you're doing there is that you're reporting what had happened in the past, right? You have a team that is there to characterize historical performance, and that's great to help you make better decisions going forward. But that's just stage 1 of the whole cycle of the performance measurement culture. What you want to end up going towards is the stage 5, where if you see the color coding of those of that evolution, there's a lot more analytics involved. There's continuous updates, and you're essentially doing a lot more of what-if scenarios. You're forward thinking. So that's where you want to go into, essentially. You're going from one stage where you're reporting historical past performances, which is great, but you want to end up almost predicting, hey, what would happen in this scenario? What would happen in this other scenario? And that, I mean, you can see this in the global economy. What happened with the earthquake of 2011 in Japan? How did that change everybody's supply chain, right? So some of these things are unpredictable. You can't predict these natural disasters, but there are a lot of things that is under your control that you need to start thinking about. And one of the things that we put here on the right-hand side is the pyramid of certain KPIs. So you talk about cost detail, you talk about variance, production, plant utilization, then you go further up the process until you get to the demand forecast. But that's just a little glimpse of certain KPIs that are useful all along the chain. The evolution of the supply chain involves reporting what happened, and you need to make sure you reach supply chain excellence. And when you get there, you actually interpret the results and you state what could happen. And that's what's important about here. And that's a great case study of Danaher, because they started predicting what actually happened. They were able to align their strategy with what potential what-if scenarios. The next key lever that I want to introduce as an example, the case study, is from Sarah. Just to give you a little color of what Sarah is. Sarah is a manufacturer of clothing line manufacturer. It does a great job of getting to market the latest trends, and that's very hard in the retail industry. I mean, one of the major, biggest, smartest companies within this industry is the H&Ms, the Mangos, the Zaras. They are Europe's most profitable apparel companies, and what they've done is they've incorporated agility into every link within their supply chain. So here, what Sarah does, and you see all their businesses, Bershka, Massimo Dutti, etc. They have 6,300 stores in Europe, $16.7 billion, euros of revenue. So this is a major success story of how this industry, prior to their success, was very hard and very competitive, but Sarah came out on top. And what happened there? How did they do that? They were able to become flexible. And why? How did they become that? They were customer focused. So they were able to understand the desires of the customer. They wanted to feel fashionable. They wanted to afford as much as possible, because being trendy is costly. But they also wanted to have a variety of products, and they didn't want to diminish any of the quality components, because you have that conundrum of cost versus quality. But Sarah did a great job of cutting through that. So they were essentially, Sarah was able to reduce the time from the catwalk, whatever you saw in the designers, into the stores dramatically. So essentially, a customer could see what was out there in the magazine from the latest catwalk in Paris, New York, what have you, and a couple of weeks later you see it in the stores, and that's incredible. It's incredible lead time. They were able to reduce costs of the supply chain by being so flexible and agile, and they were able to pass down those cost savings to the consumers. And because of being able to launch the products quickly to the market, they were able to have a variety of products because their costs were so low. And this did not degrade into their quality and workmanship in the stores. So that was a great success story of Sarah and how things went right with flexibility and building agility in the supply chain. Now here, as far as how to get there, right, Sarah is not an overnight story. It's been building their success story throughout the years. And here you have a basic general model of who are the major players within the supply chain. You have the customers that involve, the customers are intertwined within the manufacturing piece, the retail piece, logistics, supplier, and warehouse piece. And all those bubbles outside of the customers are in the control of an organization, especially within a supply chain organization that is striving for supply chain excellence. So just to give you some color comments here, Sarah was able to essentially link up with all these the manufacturers, the retailers, all these links, and they were able to promote and flow information from the suppliers to essentially the customers. And you want to always plan and have a mitigating risk, plan for those mitigating risk scenarios, right? So you want to make sure that you are talking to your manufacturer and also your retailer and understanding what some of these potential problems are occurring, that bringing them in the loop so that way you can come up with ideas that you probably weren't aware of that is affecting your retailer, your supplier, your logistics and warehousing, right? I come, as I mentioned before, I'm from the military, and we always trained on scenarios. And that's essentially what an organization striving for supply chain excellence has to do. They have to train for certain scenarios that might be unlikely, but that can be probable, right? So you want to make sure that, you know, I always refer to the earthquake in Japan. How did that affect supply chain operations, right? What you see here affected everything here. They affected from the manufacturer all the way down to the warehouse. So you want to be able to draw up contingency plans and develop crisis management teams to handle this situation.
Yeah, and another example, piggybacking on David's comments, if you look at recently with the Port of Long Beach or the Port of Los Angeles with the strike going on, you always have to have contingency plans with your carriers, especially if you're the type of manufacturing or distribution company that's highly relies on Chinese-produced products. In this particular case, you need to really look at alternate means of shipping product. Do you go to another port on the West Coast, up in in Canada, the Port Rupert Sound? Do you look at more through the canal? Do you need to ship some of your products, via airplane? Costly, but better than losing customers for not having product. So the point is here, you always have to stay ahead in terms of what's going on out there with all the factors and variables that influence and or impact your supply chain, and have plans always drawn up, such as the one example I just mentioned, to ensure that your products are always there when you need them. It's not just China. Many companies now are looking at alternate manufacturing sites outside of China's other low-cost production countries, which could be other countries in Asia. It could be in Latin America. But the point here, or the key takeaway here, is you've got to have contingency plans in place.
Right, and just to go off of that point, that's a great point. You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket, essentially. And what caused the resulting effect within the supply chain organizations with these natural disasters that have occurred, the Japanese earthquake, the volcano eruption in Iceland, you have to start thinking about this. And one of the after effects of the Japan earthquake was that it no longer is the major producer of semiconductors. Because of that, you had the HPs, the Intels, all banking on the Japanese production line, and when things went awry, they had to shift focus, and now they were shifting all their production to South Korea, Taiwan, and even China. So that's a great point, Manny. Now the key lever number 4 that we want to talk about is the network collaboration and alignment. I mean, if you've been understanding where all these key levers are coming from, you understand that this is very important piece. You need to have network collaboration throughout your supply chain. And a classic case is Cisco here, where they were essentially trying to get to that supply chain excellence piece, but there's a good learning opportunity from this. They were essentially rewarding contract manufacturers to build buffer stocks because Cisco wanted a very agile supply chain, but they didn't do it effectively enough. And what happened there? Essentially, when demand slowed down, this recent crisis, Cisco found that it couldn't cut off supplies quickly enough. Why hadn't it done that? Because many contractors believed that Cisco had implicitly assured them it would buy everything they could produce because they were incentivized that way. So this is a classic example of how Cisco tried to do it properly, but didn't think of all the contingency plans going forward, right? Didn't incorporate what would happen if there was a natural disaster, what would happen if there was an economic downturn, how would these incentives actually backfire, and that was the case here. It actually backfired and caused them with surplus inventory, and they had to essentially write down 2.5 billion worth of raw materials because of that. Now, how do you get to the right steps of network collaboration and alignment? I've taken a very simplistic approach here, but this is essentially what we do with our clients. And I'm sure Manny could talk more about this, but we essentially start with monthly or weekly updates on demand and inventory. This is going back to Manny's point about the S&OP process, right? Communication, internal communication is key. Once you have internal communication and you understand the true demand, then you try to improve on visibility, right? Talk about real cost. What's the real cost behind bringing in this product from this location as opposed to this location? Understanding those network intricacies between one supplier and another. Then you want to align incentives once you have all that. Going back to the Cisco example, they try to do that. However, you want to make sure you align those incentives and reward your suppliers or your partners adequately, but also keep in mind these contingency plans, right? And then finally, you want to coordinate these decisions. There are different methods of having a right network collaboration. We jotted some down here. We want to make sure you exchange information freely from vendors to customers. You want to maybe go in. Another method would be laying down key roles and responsibilities for our organization and the suppliers or our partners. And what Cisco try to do is give them some type of incentive, whether it be sharing risks, costs, or gains on improvement initiatives. And I think here, Manny, I think from what we spoke about earlier, you gave me a great example on this and what your previous engagement on increasing capacity.
Yeah, and one of the things around this particular case, collaboration and alignment with your suppliers, is around capacity. In many cases, part of the building relationships with your suppliers, it's releasing the information to them, forecast well in advance. And the other one is about securing capacity, is committing. If you're comfortable with your demand patterns, one of the ways to ensure capacity is committing to capacity. We're going to talk about Apple in a couple of minutes, but Apple does that. In many cases, they actually prepay their suppliers in advance in order to secure the capacity and ensure the commitment for the product. Outside of manufacturing, from the transportation perspective, same thing goes with ocean shipments, for example. If you're looking at securing capacity, you go through time volume agreements, and part of your agreements ensures that the service levels are well established in order to commit, in order to guarantee the capacity. But part of that too is, again, the communication and the ongoing relationships you have to build upstream with your suppliers. Another comment here I wanted to make is supply chain leaders are also moving into not just collaboration, but what I'll call deep collaboration or multi-tier collaboration. And that's really a means of establishing close interactions at multiple levels of relevant supply chains. Keep in mind that many companies don't just have a supply chain. They have multiple supply chains. And those supply chains are defined based on the needs of their customers. It could be a fast supply chain. It could be your normal traditional supply chain. It could be some sort of an emergency supply chain, which goes through different echelons across the supply chain. But at a minimum, when you look at deep collaboration, it's not just looking and working with your suppliers, it's working with your suppliers' suppliers. It's not just with your customers, but equally important at working with your customers' customers.
Right. And now we go into the fifth key lever, and this is a great example of an organization that continually strives for improvement. Now, I own an iPhone, and so does Manny here, and if we look back at this chart, we can almost say that the iPhone that we have now came back to the original iPod. I mean, who've had those before? I remember having the second version of the iPod. It was literally a brick, but it played music, and it definitely changed the industry because prior to that was what? Walkmans, Manny, what did you have before?
He's calling me old. Go ahead.
So essentially, why am I getting to this iPod example is because they continuously improve their products, right? And essentially, you see the graph here and what it branched out to, right, all the way to an iPad. So this is because Apple was able to listen to the customer, and that you had three types of voices here. You had to listen to the voice of the the process, listen to the voice of the customer, and listen to the sounds of frustration. Essentially, when you do continuous improvement initiatives, you have to take all these three items into consideration so you can get the full picture, right? So when we go into continuous improvement engagements, as I mentioned before, I'm in the process improvement division within Oxys. We use a Lean Six Sigma approach, definitely use the DMAIC approach, which is define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. And we use this methodology because not only has it been successful across the industry, but it helps us gather our thoughts and identifying where the sounds of frustration are, right? When we go down and we interview clients, we make sure that we understand where the frustration lies, not just within this piece of the supply chain puzzle, but within the other piece. It could be third-party logistics providers, or it could be, you know, other within maybe finance or accounting, right? And because they're all intertwined. And Apple is a great example of how they've been able to evolve their supply chain because these new products were a heavy burden within their supply chain, but they were able to get to market relatively quickly. And that's why Gartner has ranked Apple's supply chain #1 in the last 7 years. So here we talk about the continuous improvement model, and I've touched on it before of how we go about it. We go about it with a DMAIC approach, that we want to make sure that we are creating a sustainable process that is also not just right for the organization now, but it's also will be great for the organization, you know, 2, 5, 10 years from now, right? Because you want to make sure it's sustainable for the growth that lies ahead, right? So you want to use a proven methodology, and one of the biggest challenges that we have whenever we go into organizations thriving for supply chain excellence is not having a proper methodology in place. So we want to make sure that we are driving a rapid shift in paradigms, and we want to make sure what we do is simple, it makes sense, but it also achieves the desired result.
Great. Thank you, David. And that was a great overview of the 5 key supply chain levers. Before we, get down to the end of our webinar today, I wanted to touch base briefly on some of the trends, and I think we've covered some of these. Network companies, as you heard from David, they always come out ahead. That whole communication protocol, keeping a tight interaction upstream through the supply chain, downstream through the supply chain. I talked about that whole deep collaboration of it's not just your suppliers, but your suppliers. It's not just your customers, but it's your customers to customers. It's those types of interactions that really allow companies to stick out and be in front of the pack in terms of supply chain excellence. Flexibility, by having that collaboration, it allows you to be flexible because of the communication, because of keeping everyone involved. A plan is a plan is a plan, but there's always changes to plans. That's the reality of life. And having the ability to have strong collaborative networks, having the ability to have in place scenarios to mitigate risk, allows you to be flexible when in times of volatility and ever-changing customer demands. And part of that is what we call big data. Big data allows you to really, you could call it metadata, where you're connecting multiple databases and really keen on key information. It's that key information that allows you to share with your upstream partners, your downstream partners, and really stay ahead of the curve in terms of leading towards supply chain excellence. Now, a couple other points I'll hit on quickly is the Internet of Things. That's a rather new term. I'm assuming many of you have heard the concept of Internet of Things, but mobile computing and embedding new computing devices that is an offshoot of the Internet. So the Internet is not just a machine-to-machine interaction. It's not just accessing the Internet with laptops and computers. Now there's so many ways to access information and truly the visibility, whether it's smartphones, now you're going to get smartwatches and so forth. That is a key trend to be on the watch out in terms of how it's helping supply chains. As you see the UPSs of the world, you see a lot of transportation companies now that have the tablets and so forth. It's instant information. That instant information allows them to make en-route changes. So if they were going to deliver somewhere and they had an instant change, that's communicated, they're rerouted, so it's not like they have to wait till they get back to their hub or distribution center. They could be rerouted in transit. Same thing with customer information, and especially returns. So it's things of that nature that allows mobile computing, the Internet of Things, to evolve and develop supply chain to the next level. And then the last point I really want to hit on, and I talked about it earlier, is what is called the depreciation of knowledge. Training, learning, and especially when you have an organization that's focused on continuous improvement initiatives, it's not just a project of just implementing an initiative. It's not just improving upon it, but you have to stay close to it. You have to be able to monitor. You have to be able to control. As things change, I said earlier, technology changes. You have to look at the impact. Does this new technology, does it warrant, does it have the return on investment to apply it to existing initiatives so that you can even improve upon it better than it was. And then the other factor here is you just can't leave it alone. So if you leave it alone over time, it's going to die or it's going to go away. You have to constantly measure it, and you have to constantly improve upon it in terms of always staying ahead of the pack and looking at what is the best interest of the organization in line with delivering cost effectiveness and customer service. Right. And then lastly here, before we get into our Q&A session, we just listed out, David and I, some key takeaways. Hopefully you've learned today that working with proven technologies is key to driving towards supply chain excellence. You always want to start and drive towards success with a strategy. That strategy starts with your organization and it trickles down into your supply chain function. So it's critical that there's always alignment between the two. The whole collaborative effort, tight connections with your supply chain partners. I've said it multiple times, that whole deep collaboration of your suppliers, and customers, and customers. There's a lot of work, and you have to, it's like a relationship. You always have to work at it. And by working at it, it improves over time, and the relationship, the level of trust that you earned as a result of working on that relationship only grows. And then, the last two, you have to plan and measure. That's all about, you plan, and it's all part of the whole DMAIT factors of continuous improvement, but it's a control, it's about monitoring, you've got to analyze, and then you start all over again to improve it. And lastly, if you execute this, you have the right, and it will. You will expect results. And I think that's what's important today. In order to get there to supply chain excellence, it wasn't just about establishing one of the 5 key levers. It's about putting into motion and continuously manage and monitor the 5 key levers. And if you're doing that, you should expect results. With that, at this point in time, I will hand it back over to Yaslin.
Thank you, Manny. Thank you, David. Okay, now we're going to go over some of the questions one of our attendees is asking. It is, where do you start on the path to supply chain excellence?
Yeah, with that question, I think for the audience today, I think you have to start, as we said earlier on, you've got to have the strategy. You have to have the strategy not only from the organization that's bought into at all levels over the organization, and then trickle that down into what are the strategies that best support the overall company strategy, but at your supply chain organizational level. You also have to be able to identify where you are against those pillars. So we talked about the 3 pillars that really were part of the overall 5 levers. So the technology was one of the fundamentals or the foundation along with the performance management. But you really have to establish the performance measures that support those pillars, obviously as long as they're aligned with the strategy. And then clearly understand the technology that's required to not only support the pillars, but equally the strategy. And then lastly, I think it's clearly important to have the right people in place, providing the right tools for your people, providing the right training and development of your organization so that they can all be part of a team effort to achieve excellence.
Great. Thank you, Manny.
Yaslin?
Thank you, Manny. And our last question here is, how do you know that you've reached supply chain excellence?
Thank you, Yaslin. That's a great question. You know, sometimes when you are going through the 5 key levers, we always ask ourselves, where are we within that, right? The question, I guess, is you're never quite there yet. There's always a continuous improvement piece of that that's driving you and taking you to a next level. And like as we've been saying before, things change, technology changes that require you to go back into one of these levers and say, hey, are we doing this right? Are we measuring this new technology piece right? Is that a proper KPI, right? Do we have the proper collaboration of this new technology? Have we created that new proper flexibility for that? So things are always evolving and changing. You know, but I'd say how you start is you start with getting a manageable set of targets, and you're progressively making changes to get you there, right? So that's probably the overall solution to, or the evolution of how do you get to supply chain excellence, and how do you know that you're there? You know, you could argue that Apple is there already because they've won all these awards, but what happens next year? Is Apple content with where they're at now next year? I would imagine and say no, right? So it's always about going to the next level, making sure you're constantly going back to those key levers and understanding where you're at and how you want to get there with these new emerging technologies.
Great. Yaslin?
Yes, that's all the questions we have for today. So I want to thank Manny and David today, and everyone who's participated and joined us today. Please watch for our follow-up email with the replay link along with a copy of this presentation. And also, if you could please take a moment to complete our brief exit survey. And on behalf of the Oxys team, thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.